But wow, I mean, this is a bit of a trip. I don't know where to start.
Well,
No.
I think it would be nice to start just by at least saying, "Oh, Tony Todd."
Oh,
Yeah.
Because I mean, without this podcast, I probably still wouldn't have got round to Candyman. Obviously, we did Candyman, and you guys were like, "Oh, you've got to see this, and we're going to podcast on it, and we're going to and I had this amazing revelation with this film and this fantastic actor. Then, of course, I subsequently I went, "Oh yes, him," and then I would see him in something else and go, "Oh yeah, he's really good." And then, of course, the news this week that he's passed. But I thought we should at least have a little thumbs up to Tony Todd, because we did
absolutely.
Obviously doing Candyman on the podcast, which was great. Well, I'm very grateful to finally have seen it.
It's been all over the horror community, obviously. There's a lot of horror films, mostly small roles as well. The Candyman was probably his biggest horror role, but he played consistent bit parts in other horror films. So he's this odd janitorial character in the Final Destination films,
right?
Who keep like turning up in every single film, and there's all sorts of like sort of theories as to who this character is.
I always get very frustrated with the industry that I have been a part of when it comes to actors like this, because obviously he was, I should get used to saying, he was so incredibly distinctive with that look, that height, that voice, that particular kind of intensity he had, that he was not someone who was going to be cast all the time in things, which is sort of frustrating, because it sort of it's the short-sightedness, the need for sort of bland everymen and everywomen to sort of take a lot of the sort of central roles, and so when I read, I thought he's great, and he'll certainly go down in horror history, but he should have done more. It's that frustration.
I know what you mean. I would have liked to have seen him in some huge breakout role, something massive, something iconic. The sort of thing that Joaquin Phoenix gets, or like something huge. I think he was of that caliber.
Oh, totally. Yeah, he's formidable in that film. In fact, it's one of those things where you've got to almost constantly push. Yeah, it's a great performance in that genre, but it's just a great performance.
Yeah, that's the other snobby thing you hear, isn't it? Within the horror genre, within horror it was great, but let's not step out of that.
Transcends that, as indeed does the film.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the funny thing about. I mean, we can't go down the road of discussing Candyman again, because we could do another bloody video about it. Well, there's enough material there. We could do another bloody video about it.
That is true.
And don't forget, there is a sequel. Which, by the way, did you guys go? Did you seek out the sequel at all?
I didn't myself. No.
No,
not yet. I think I mentioned in our original Candyman video. It's very interesting. It's not a bad horror film at all, and it's actually a fairly decent sequel to the original Candyman. It's just sometimes a little too aware that it's a film about ideas.
Yes, I remember you saying this. I remember you saying about it was that thing of, it's one of those films that announces its themes a lot.
Like literally.
You mean the remake? I thought you were talking about one of the original sequels.
No. The original sequels are just tosh. The original sequels are just like franchise baiting nonsense. They are really bad. They take what the original sequels do is they take the base mythology that's in the original Candyman, which, of course, in the original Candyman, there's no real basis for at all. It could be just tosh. It could just be a myth, but it makes it absolutely literal. It makes the Candyman a literal avenging ghost, and therefore obliterates all of the wonderful stuff in the original film. It's like, you are missing the point.
Yeah, it's a shame, because at least, for example, Hellraiser got that second film before it went into the third, and then it seems like Candyman just went right to the third Hellraiser film by the sounds of things, which is like Hellbound.
Hellbound's
amazing.
It is. It's just such an incredible film. It's a miracle that
It seems like a fluke.
like that exists.
It does seem like a fluke because the first one's good. I mean, it's really good, and then Hellbound comes along. You're like, WTF? You know?
Yes, exactly.
And then what happens? Happens. Yeah. And on that note, talking about sequels that are a step up. I remember a podcast we had where Jack said that one of his Samhain traditions is to listen to the audiobook of the Amityville Horror.
That's right.
That's right, isn't it, Jack? Yeah. And
yes,
I've seen the first film many years ago, the
1978.
79. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, it's late 70s.
But I've never seen anything subsequently. And I had a chance to see The Possession. And so I said to Jack, I said, is it worth a... I had a really good time with it, actually. I mean, for its obvious, issues, I thought the halfway through narrative switch was amazing. I thought that's really great, and I still came away.
It's the best Amityville movie.
Right. Which one is The Possession?
Because the first one was a bit, the second one, 81.
The second one, right. Yes, which is actually a fairly decent film.
Yeah, and frankly, to be caught in controversy, it does the whole demon possession far better than Exorcist because that demon's going to do shit.
Right. This demon actually does things.
Yeah, Pazuzu wasn't going to do anything. This one is going to do stuff.
Well, for one thing, this demon can use a shotgun. This demon's a real bastard. This one
actually does things. Yeah. So I actually had a good time with that. It was a very unusual film, not as unusual in a way as the film we're looking at tonight, but it had that that thing of horror films of that era and before, where they can just go off on weird tangents. It's like no one's keeping super control over them,
right?
And it's to their benefit.
Weird is the word. I mean, it gets very strange, that film. There are like really oddly queasy moments where there's a whole incest subplot.
I thought they were trying to soften it by saying that the family in it was how would you put it, a blended family, that they were divorced. No, that's the one family, and therefore the incest is in the same. It's the same family, and so, but the way the incest is played, the way the familial abuse is played, is so. There's just no lead into it. It just goes there. And then, of course, you end up with this movie, which you can find a sort of redemptive thing about the demon. It's queasy on that front as well. I had a really good time with it. Only 40 years too late.
It was the physicality of that film I loved too. Like the way, I can't remember the kid who gets possessed. I can't remember his name, but the way he physically degrades as the film goes on. I love that shit. I love that. I mean, by the end, of course, the demon literally rips its way out of him in a weird kind of exorcism, doesn't it?
Yeah, almost
in a way that I think is a direct influence on Nightmare on Elm Street 2, actually. I think there's a direct feed in there, which is fair enough, because Amityville 2 is itself a kind of hybrid. It's part Amityville, obviously, and it's part The Exorcist, and it's also part Flowers in the Attic. I think that's part of its DNA.
Course, yeah.
And it's interesting how often that works. If you take three disparate things that are very much in the zeitgeist, and you just sort of blend them, you can come up with something.
Cut them together.
It's a bit of a sore spot for me, number 2, because it is in its own. It's a much better film than the first one. The first one is almost like, it's not remotely scary.
I remember it being very dull.
Yeah, for the most part, and it's filmed like a TV movie. The second one actually feels like a film to me in a way that the first one doesn't.
It's beautifully shot in places.
It's really quite well made, actually, the second one, but it is a bit of a sore spot for me because it does slander the older girl in the DeFeo family. I mean, there does seem to have. I watched that very good documentary series about the Amityville phenomenon that came out recently. I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was a very good series, and they make this point, which is that the DeFeo family as a whole are they're kind of slandered and dishonored by this whole thing.
Yes.
And there does, as far as we can tell, there does seem to have been some domestic violence in the family, and maybe sort of slight connections with mafia families. But the amount of stuff that's talked about the DeFeos is really pretty nasty, considering what happened to them, and particularly that girl, the elder daughter. She, there are sort of conspiracy theories about her being involved in the murders, and she's the real one that made Ronnie DeFeo.
Whenever there's a woman or a girl involved,
it's bullshit. She didn't do anything wrong. She was just a nice, normal kid whose brother murdered her. So it is a bit of a sore spot.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Yeah, because it was very easy when you're in the moments of the movie to forget. Oh yeah, actually, this is really solidly riffing on the lives of real people. No, I think. But
I think it's just something like, it's just a mark I want to hit, because I feel the Amityville phenomenon is actually something I've always long been very fascinated by. So I'm just kind of a bit of a geek on it.
Right.
But
it's, the fucking Warrens. Oh my God.
Yeah.
I went into a deep dive. I did an article for Ginger Nuts of Horror about their involvement in
I read it. It's good.
Yeah. Oh my God. I mean, that actually really shocked me in the horror community when that bitch died. Elizabeth Warren, burning in the lowest level of hell, where she belongs. There was this it was because of The Conjuring. It was because of the Conjuring films. There was this outpouring from certain segments of the horror community and I was like, what is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? Hey, they're not occult superheroes. They never were. Those characters in The Conjuring are fictional. They are nothing to do with the original Warrens. The original Warrens were shysters and frauds and con artists.
Yeah,
who
parasites.
Oh my, the worst kinds of people.
Parasites on human misery, chiselers, liars. Yeah, dreadful people.
Fomented human misery just in order to hawk wares, to get movie rights and book rights and the filth, the utter filth. But it is largely because there is this weird problem that culture has where it thinks it cannot separate fictional characters from the history, from the reality. It's the most amazing thing.
It's so strange, isn't it? Because it just seems so obvious to me, even when you're watching a movie that purports to be based on history. Yeah, it's still a movie. It's not going to be. It just seems. It's almost like an integral part of the point and the fun and the experience of watching a movie that's ostensibly based on historical facts is to watch how they've turned it into a fictional narrative, because that's what every true story is. It's a fiction which is very, very loosely based on some things that really happened. But this is why I kind of have this little itch at the back of my brain that makes me want to point out that although Amityville 2: The Possession is a fun, but schlocky horror movie, it does just lie about this family and particularly this girl who was murdered, because millions of people do not get it.
No, you're
they
absolutely
watch these things and they think it's true.
Closer to the events as well. When it came out, it came out 40 years ago, much closer to the events.
Yeah, of course.
Not even so much as a kind of faux tasteful gap, really.
No, it was still pretty raw, wasn't it? Actually, that in and of itself is a bit of a wrinkle for me. It sends some shivers up my spine. The fact that there was a fictionalized film so quickly,
so
after the event.
Yeah.
I was talking about that documentary series about the whole Amityville phenomenon, and they interview people that knew that girl. They interview her friends from high school, and they talk about how hurtful it was for them to see this film.
But then I think there's something to be said about 1981, it's still the long 70s, and it's one of the points that I think I bulleted for tonight's film, which is just how exploitative film became, largely because censorship was relaxed as it was in the late 60s, and of course 60s idealism gives way to this sort of dark, murky decade, which is of course infinitely fascinating, particularly probably because we're either born so close to it or in it, and it feels like a lodestone on everything that's come since. I always think of the 70s as being, in a sense, the first decade of the 21st century.
It is so uninhibited, this cinema,
but
isn't it?
The levels of exploitation and Blood on Satan's Claw absolutely goes there as well.
Oh yeah, it does.
To the point where you not just this film, but many of its contemporaries as well, where it goes beyond queasy, and you're thinking, actually, do we need any of this, or what can be done about this, or how can we read it?
I mean, Blood on Satan's Claw is interesting. It's not even in terms of the actual subject matter that is exploitative. It's not. It doesn't even go to many of the depths or places that a lot of the more infamous 1970s films do. It's largely due to the framing and what it is portraying. I mean, this film's got a thing about children, doesn't it? Yeah. This film has a real bug up its arse about children and youth. It doesn't like children at all, and it doesn't like youthfulness. It portrays children as aliens, as these even before there's any supernatural shenanigans going on. Children are just weird, disruptive entities that they are not born into states of grace, right? According to this film, the only way they become graceful is by being beaten down and taught how to operate and behave and conform.
Yeah, and it's I found it interesting that in our chat before we assembled to do this, you had used the word paedophobia, and I'd bulleted the word paedophobia in my sort of ramshackle bullet points that I pulled together as I was watching this film, because we talked about paedophobia and things like The Omen when we did that film in the podcast, which again is embedded, like so many of this, in 70s 80s horror in particular.
Exactly.
So, and there is such an extreme this is such an extreme, though, I think, because the idea of the beast, or the behemoth, terrifying adults because the kids aren't behaving innocently as they should. I mean, there's an element of satire there, because of course we've got to remember this is the age of where they were talking in terms of the promiscuous society, where they were always making jokes about that in old 70s sitcoms. But the sexual liberation seems really under scrutiny in this film, because
it really does.
We're positioned, if you like, to share the fears of the grown-up characters, but the behemoth is older than they are. It reveals this earlier truth, that Puritanism was attempting to smother, and that's I think particularly effective when the film is depicting an era that obviously sees these seismic shifts between Catholicism and Protestantism, and there's been the Civil War and so on. And the very thing, of course, you said about children being in a state of innocence, I just kept thinking about, it's not so long after the Romantic poets had started to challenge that notion of the innocent child, and there's the propaganda value in insisting that kids are somehow ring-fenced from ideas of the flesh. They don't have sexual thoughts, and that, of course, travels into the 70s, into the present. It's the post-hippie era. It's post-Manson, and I just kept thinking, well, yeah, to a degree, we all play this game to preserve the concept of childhood innocence, and not without sound reasoning, because kids are, easily victims of adults preying their lack of agency and the power imbalances to do things like sexually dominate them. But we reinforce, I think, continually how somehow we didn't also have lots of sexual feelings or nascent sexual awareness when we were, I don't know, 8 years old or something, because we did. So there's that constant playing of a contradiction or a dichotomy, I think, and this film does tap into that.
It's a very strange thing, because you weigh that element against the exploitative nature of its framing whenever there is something, but it's not even sexual as such. It's really grubby and rapine and objectifying. But this film also objectifies the bodies, particularly of young women.
Yeah.
And is kind of lurid about them. By the way, I don't want to give the impression that I dislike this film. I don't. I think this film is baller. I think it's great fun. It's amazing fun to experience. But it does whenever you pare away the surface and you pare a little bit deeper, there's so many internal contradictions and ambiguities and problems where it's
so
stitched
many
together in a weird way, and this is definitely one of them.
I mean, I love this film. But I think that it's part of my love of this film is firmly linked to its flaws, because I mean, we all know, and I'm sure everyone who's familiar with this film who's listening in, that it was meant to be a kind of portmanteau movie, almost like the old Amicus anthology films or something like the Ealing Dead of Night. But we end up with this because during the making of it, there was this idea from the director, well, let's try and integrate it all into one narrative. What we end up with is this sort of curiously free-floating, unmoored, hazy, strange experience.
It's like delirium, right?
Yeah, it's like delirium.
Strange film where there are plots and characters that don't really make sense. Like a great example, the judge. The judge is fantastic. He's so interesting. I mean, beautifully played, by the way. I mean, absolutely beautifully played. But he has these strange...
by present day Anthony Hopkins, who went back in time somehow.
Yes. So, I mean, it is one of the things to love about this film is that the older actors are doing these big, fruity performances that are so overstated and dominant. It's a joy. It's an absolute joy to experience.
It was his last role, actually, Weimar.
Was it?
I think so.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I
think he died fairly young. Yeah, I think that is his last role.
Wow. Well, I mean, it's very good. It's a great performance. It's very theatrical, very over the top, dominating. Whenever he's in a scene, he completely dominates everything. The voice, the persona, everything. But he has these. You can see the bits where it's stitched together, where the several different stories are stitched together. So he has this weird thing where he is aware that there are odd things happening in this little village, and he just goes.
Yeah.
He just fucks
off.
He just fucks off, right?
Yeah.
And
I'll take the book and I'll be back, probably.
And that's the other thing, right? Before anything seemingly supernatural starts to happen, he is this seeming rational. He's the voice of reason and rationality.
Yeah, he's a total skeptic. Yeah.
Total skeptic. But by the time he leaves, he starts giving these profound omens about how you need to let the evil swell, and let the evil swell. And it's like, what are you talking about? There's been no transition between your rationalist self, which is very cynical and very condemnatory of these people you clearly regard as sort of like, country bumpkins, a little bit uneducated and whatnot. And suddenly you are talking like a prophet or like a witch hunter or something.
I think one of the reasons that
the Groucho Marx doctor showed him the book. If you look that book up, it's just a French commercial dictionary. Presumably they used that. I mean, that's a question in itself. Why did they use that book? They might have used it as a stand-in for another book, which is in the film. It's the hang on a second. I've got this written down. It's the Dictionnaire Universel de Commerce. Well, there is another book, apparently, the Dictionnaire Infernal. Which they might have just been using it because the cover, looks right. It recalls the Malleus Maleficarum and everything.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, that book in itself is completely irrelevant. But the Groucho Marx doctor gives the book of French commercial terms to the judge, and it's like, oh yes, I believe in the supernatural now.
Suddenly, I just believe. At that point, he hasn't even actually witnessed anything really.
But I think one of the reasons I can defend an awful lot of this, even knowing that actually what we're talking about is an idea during production which didn't quite work, and therefore you do end up with this jointed and somewhat sloppy film. But I think its setting, its temporal setting, I think gives a lot of slack for me, because this is such a choke point in our history, such a moment of seismic shifts and contradictions that I can, and also we do have the baleful influence of the Behemoth as soon as it. I can buy in to a lot of the contradictions and inconsistencies and the way different parts of it allied or don't marry up. because of the combination of the supernatural element and the point it's in history that it's occurring in. And actually, I just one little aside, but it's actually one of the things I really love about Blood on Satan's Claw over any of the others, really, in the so-called folk horror triptych, or however it's referred. And I say that with great respect to The Wicker Man, if not so much for The Witchfinder General, because there's no bollocks here. This is the supernatural absolutely is present in this film in the way it isn't present in those others. It's real. It's not ceremony. It's not as it is in Wicker Man and Midsummer, which we did last time. It's the real deal. It comes up through the very earth that's been plowed. I love that. And
there are wrinkles. I mean, there are complexities, which I really love in the film, actually. Like, you get this right from the moment it starts, you get this creature, you get this entity, which is dug up from beneath the earth, which is clearly being buried there in some more ancient time. You have no idea what it is. You have no idea what its nature is. And you don't really get much of an explanation within the film itself. You get vague allusions. So the kids ultimately start calling it Behemoth, which is the name of a biblical demon. And before that, it's the name of an old sort of entity, an old mythic entity, a god, a primordial force of chaos, blah, 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 blah. In the Book of Job, it's referred to as like a great beast or something to that effect. But there's actually some...
It's this great incoherent corporate monster made of, it's never corporate as well. The description in Job is fascinating because
it is.
Its individual parts are described using these wildly incoherent metaphors, but the whole thing is never. So the picture you get of Behemoth is that it's this great sort of incoherent conglomeration of bits and pieces. It's actually described as God's first creation in the Bible.
God's first creation, yes. Which can only
Behemoth is like his first attempt. Yeah.
And I love that because I think because it's in recent pop cinema memory as well, that idea of, the sort of Nigel Neal thing from Quatermass and the Pit. It's the disturbance of the ground, but also again because of the times, because human beings are laboring animals. This is an image of subsistence farming. And we need to dig, we need to plow to survive, but there's this stuff under the earth that can be churned up, long repressed stuff, and
it's the Gothic stuff, isn't it?
It's the Gothic are all underground, and
it's a recrudescence.
The remains of, and I love that what you said about the corporate. It is this creature, this devil's, this demon's physical form. It's material. It's there. It's not just an idea. The consciousness is gone, or it's about to reassert, and a new body will be built up. Using the flesh of the local children. It's sort of folk horror Frankenstein, really. But it absolutely says the devil is tangible.
I think that's why it's called Behemoth.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, they call it Behemoth anyway because it's made from bits and pieces of them. So it is it is Frankensteinian. It is like a kind of a community-made Frankenstein's monster, where everybody sort of donates a part of the. Well, they don't donate; it's taken. But everybody gives a part of themselves, and they assemble like this jigsaw, this corporate creator. I'm also, of course, inevitably. I'm going to think about the political reading, which of course Behemoth is a book by Thomas Hobbes, in which what he's referring to in Behemoth is the Long Parliament, which is the Parliament that goes right. It's ostensibly the Parliament that goes right the way through the English Civil War, as opposed to his more famous book Leviathan, and they are the two. They're named after the two great sort of primordial biblical monsters,
serpents of
Leviathan and Behemoth. Yeah. Exactly. And Leviathan for Hobbes is what he takes as the antidote to Behemoth, the form of government where there's the social contract with the absolute ruler, the absolute sovereign. And that's how you suppress the war of all against all. And Behemoth, by extension, is the opposite of that. Behemoth is the war of all against all, which is let rip for Hobbes, of course, in the Civil War by the Long Parliament, the decadence of the Long Parliament. And this is all set. One of the crucial moments in the film for me is the very strange moment when the judge toasts James III, our Catholic Majesty James III, and keep him in exile. And the way Wymark says that is so fascinating, because by his tone you could read it as keep him in exile, that is to say, keep him in exile, well. Keep him out, or keep him well. Exactly. So it's ambiguous.
But I think that ambiguity, that contradiction, runs so deeply throughout the film, and in so many ways accidentally, that it starts to feel intentional. And this is why I say I can give the film an awful lot of slack.
Me too. I mean, I know I was exaggerating the sort of effect earlier, but no, I can give this film so much slack just because of there's just a nature to it. The way it's shot, the way it's put together, it has a kind of dream logic going on, a nightmare logic, particularly when Behemoth turns up, because the Behemoth itself is really incoherent. It's really incoherent. You don't really get much in the way of exposition or explanation of what it is doing. You have to infer. None. Not really. And even the name Behemoth, it's biblical and it's a demon, but that's an attribution by the kids, right?
Yeah.
There's really no confirmation from the entity itself what on earth it is, or
because we don't know how
if
much.
They know these, if they know these terms, they're getting them from Reverend Fallowfield, aren't they? Because they learn these terms from Reverend Fallowfield, so they're adapting something they've heard at the chapel school, the little chapel school, from the Reverend, to try to express something, to try to express this very incoherence. They are trying, by calling it that, they are trying to understand what it is that's happening to them. And the fascinating thing about the Behemoth figure, when you see it at the end, where it is ritually destroyed by the judge and therefore by Leviathan, Hobbes's vision is literally being dramatized on screen here. Leviathan slays Behemoth.
Using a sword, using the violence.
Exactly, What you see, Behemoth is actually this kind of pathetic figure. It's sad and shambling and huddled in the corner and weak and shrouded and very, very easily defeated.
And it always bugs me when people say that people say that is the biggest flaw of the film, is the realization of Behemoth. No, that absolutely works. That form, that kind of puppet, that pathetic creature that's half made up, that doesn't convince. I mean, firstly, it makes a great sense of the fact that it is easier to dispatch, physically easier to dispatch, being so pathetic, but it works for me. And yet I've read various reviews. Oh, it would have been so much better if that had been a far more convincing. No, the fact it isn't convincing works aesthetically, works for what it's trying to do.
Absolutely, yeah. It really works as well when you consider that it's almost like a child's game, isn't it? It's a child's construction, so it's a child's imagining.
Gameplay.
Now, Daddy's home, right? Daddy's not having any nonsense. Daddy doesn't buy into this.
It's funny you say about Daddy coming home as well, because just to pick up on the point you made earlier, George, about the judge, who's ostensibly the central character, who just goes missing for half the film, because it's one of the many bizarre things about this film. And again, all I kept thinking was, because this film has manifested in the way it's manifested, and because it's from the era it's from, I mean, it's era as a film, not the era it's depicting, I just couldn't help but thinking of all the other films I wish would have done the same. And I just kept thinking of things like, bizarrely, I kept thinking of things like Blade Runner, and thinking, as much as I love Harrison Ford, you sort of want Deckard off screen for much longer than he is, rather like the judge. Deckard should be this sort of shadowy presence who just provides a little background glue to the narrative. We should have Roy Batty in so much earlier. And Claw. And he's the lead. I mean, he's the lead in absentia. Roy Batty.
Blade Runner is another film, many films of this type, where the wrong character is the lead character.
Absolutely.
The film doesn't know it, but the villain is made into the hero.
Exactly. And in Satan's Claw, we get our cake, because by getting rid of the judge, I mean, not only does that really allow us into the darkness of the piece to unfold, but we then get the best central performance that we could from this remarkably young woman as well, and that plays to its strength. It's a mistake in pure filmmaking terms, in pure narrative films, that works.
It does. I mean, the other thing it does is it removes the patriarchal figure, of course. It removes the paternal figure, which within the politics of the film, it removes stability. That's kind of what it's getting at in a way, without that strong, certain, rational, paternal figure. Things are breaking down, and then suddenly he comes home and sets it all right again. I mean, it is. I mean, it's one of the areas. Like, the politics of it can be read as quite objectionable.
Oh, I think it's
you know, it's
I
very
don't know how you
know.
I personally I love this movie. This is absolutely one of my favorite movies of all time. I don't know how you interpret the politics as anything other than deeply offensively reactionary. It just is, you know.
Interesting wrinkles in the point you made again earlier, George, about Weimarks, we must let this grow. I mean, my God, not only is he ruthless as an authority figure, but his whole gambit that the horror must grow, it must be revealed in full before he'll return to do anything about it, lest we forget. And you start to think, wow, there's a sort of propaganda value in this, because this will raise his profile should he win out. The useful side effect will dampen down the society under his care, make them pliant, even if it means, lots of kids will die. And what's really striking is the vocabulary. There's a lovely thing there and no one picks him up on it, and it runs against a shop-worn term. He says, we must let this horror grow. And yet we're instructed both figuratively and actually to always nip things in the bud should they start to get out of hand. Nip it in the bud. He twists that idea, that accepted shop-worn trope, and it's totally for political gain. His political gain. And it absolutely is what you're saying about there's no other way to read it. There's no other way to read the film. It is reactionary, and it is about this judge fucking off for half a film, and to let things get worse, to let Amity get overrun by the shark, and then to come back and play Quint when actually he's Mayor Vaughan.
The film frames him as the hero, doesn't it? The film absolutely frames him as the returning, conquering hero.
But you can pull out some of the hypocrisy, which is lovely. It's just there in shadow.
The question of framing is really interesting. I don't know if either of you have listened to the radio production from a few years back now. I think it was made for Audible to release. They did a sort of audio play version of it. Mark Gatiss is in it, and because he's in all this stuff.
Of course.
And it's a really weird thing. They try to take this source material and sort of hammer it into something like coherent, recognizable narrative shape, right? We're still left with the basic outline, which, as you said before, is visibly three different stories stuck together. You have the young man that comes back with his fiancée in the haunted attic, and the other stories, etc. It's still visibly three separate stories, sort of welded together in like Behemoth, but they've done their best to streamline it and make things feel joined up and coherent and so on. And they've ironed out the tonal kinks. So they've made the adult, quote unquote, heroic characters tonally through performance and everything. They've made them seem likable. Reverend Fallowfield, the judge, and even the squire. They've turned this trio of male adult authority figures into people who we, the listener, can identify as like the team of good guys, like Arthur and Quincy and Jonathan Harker, and they've done that with them. And it is so weird to compare these two versions of the same text, because although this is definitely this is a post-60s counter-revolutionary film. This is about how young people on peace marches and hippies and this entire youth movement throughout the 60s is evil. It's always going to end up with the Manson family, and what we need is to have social order restored. And so that's just what it is. That's just what it says. There's no way around that. But at the same time, tonally, the adults in this film are weird and creepy and nasty. Like the judge is this flailing, drunken bastard and bully. The Reverend Fallowfield, in terms of what he does, He doesn't do anything particularly bad. Even when Angel comes to tempt him, he does not yield to temptation. He doesn't do anything wrong. But he's played by Ainley giving this very, very strange, weird, creepy performance.
Yes.
And the aunt as well at the beginning, the aunt who's being needlessly nasty to her nephew's fiance all the way through. I mean, apart from one character, Ellen, the servant, who's the mother of Kathy and Mark, apart from her, all these responsible establishment adults are, although they play the narrative role of heroes in the film, in terms of the performances and the things they're given to do and the way they behave, they're dicks.
Oh, yeah, they are. Yeah, they absolutely are. And I think
is of course infantilized. She will be seen as closer to the children because she's a servant.
Yeah,
absolutely. But no, you're absolutely. But what I think is just endlessly fascinating about this is, again, it's that word again. It's the contradictions that the film grapples with. I mean, even regarding the supernatural and witchcraft, which plays into the political side of it, because you keep getting these oppositions. It's natural, but it's unnatural.
Yep.
It liberates, but it destroys.
It's
it
physical,
is arousing,
but it's ideological,
because the film is full of sex, but it's repelling. But of course, like you said, Jack, this film is about how all this is a threat to the judge's world. To the coming of modernity, and yet it, in its own way, contains just as many contradictions as that modernity will give rise to. In Empire, for instance, something that is about to take off in the history of England at this point, which is liberating insofar as it galvanizes a country, it gives rise to an idea of exceptionalism, it frees up new resources, but it's also incredibly destructive. It arouses excitement but repels victims, and anyone in that society who fails to fall into line with it. Of course, it's a natural emerging of one system from another, but that's still a man-made thing because history is ours. So all these things are part of the same film. So
often unconsciously, right? It's not deliberate. It's a mistake a lot of the time, but it's what makes the film so interesting.
But it's that point in time that it's set, because it is so full of these seismic shifts and these massive contradictions.
And also the setting.
You can read the mistakes or the ambiguities of the movie very much using that as almost a schema. Yeah. It's like, it's because it's set then. It's the Glorious Revolution. We're post-Civil War. We're about to head into empire. We're about to, mercantile capitalism is about to start going through this seismic shift into something else. The Enlightenment is to the era does a lot of the heavy lifting, or that's the wrong metaphor. It glosses over a lot of the film's problems, I think, and then it starts to become fascinating, and you start to want to rewatch it.
Yeah, I mean, the setting does the same thing, right? The fact that it is set in the country, it's set in a culture which is perhaps a little bit behind most of the rest of the country in terms of its education, whatever new discoveries are happening, social transformation, etc. It's where these old ideas still hold sway, and somehow that's a good thing. That's portrayed as a good thing here. It's so fascinating. I mean, the portrayal of the children, there's so much that's complex there in this film, not deliberately. The absolute stated politics of the film is that the children are alien and strange and willful and creatures of abandon.
It's Village of the Damned, isn't it? I mean,
it's Village of the Damned. Yeah. And yet, there is this sense in the film that it's the very uses of this restrictive, oppressive situation that gives rise to the culture that the children try to create with the behemoth, right?
That's the point I think I was sort of in a haphazard way trying to come to. This is England. This is our England.
There'd be no space for the behemoth to take hold, for this other culture, this other ideology to take hold if they were being served.
Yeah.
If this culture was giving something to them instead of just oppressing them and calling them monsters the entire time. That's the other thing, by the way. This culture already thinks of them as little monsters, little damned demonic creatures that need a good, oppressive, religious hand to bring them into line, to give them grace back, yeah?
Yeah.
So they're just acting according to their natures in a way, and the behemoth is almost like an expression of that.
and also an agent of change, because as I was just saying, this England is just about to give birth. It is, the harbinger of imperialism, massive scale murder, racism, exploitation. And we're back to the moment when all this is about to take off. As I say, all those shifts that lead the country, to dominate the seas, and the technology that has them sweep over continents, and the force of history that, is going to have us engage in this rapacious accumulation. That's all on the rise. And into it, the behemoth, the devil, wants to take the kids. It wants to rebuild itself by the youngsters who are yet to be a part of that. So it can be read as in a curious way as an angel of change. And that's why I think the final shot is so interesting, of the judge with the fire reflected in his eyes, which I think is a key image. The grown-ups, the adults, well, they don't need the beast except as something to keep the plebs in line, just as they use God symbolically, as a tool to enforce power and social and political stability. But he, as a judge, as an establishment figure in this transforming England, he's just kicked out the devil.
Right.
They can,
a bit of grit in the machine, right?
Yeah, they can undertake this next phase, this phase of modernity, this Enlightenment phase, this imperial phase, without it. The judge and his class are enough, and the kids are put back in their place. But in that freeze frame at the end of the movie, and it's the way Weimar plays it, and it's the way that it's shot, he's fascinated by it in that last moment for all the things he professes otherwise. He's mesmerized by Behemoth. And
that freeze frame is also of a single eye as well.
Yes,
and
as it
right.
That echoes
It'll start again. It'll start again. It's already started again. That thing's come up through the earth more than once.
Yeah, right. So accidentally, symbolically, it's drawing parallels, which is actually, again, it's a wrinkle. It makes the film so much more interesting when you take it.
And then you get the seasonal thing, the farming thing. It all starts to knit together. The cycles of history, the cycles of violence.
And you see that again and again.
Children, progeny.
Where do the children actually conduct their rituals? It's in the old church, right? It's in the
old church. Yeah, the old ruined church.
Not Fallowfield. Brilliant name, by the way. That's beautifully, beautifully done. The Reverend Fallowfield. I mean, that's just perfect.
I might steal that, by the way. That might turn up in one of my stories. I like it a lot.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that happens again and again in stories that I mean. We constantly in our literature, particularly in our Gothic literature, we constantly write about the Reformation, and one of the things that we do in that sort of storytelling is that we conflate the Catholic past before the Protestant Reformation with the pre-Christian past. It becomes weirdly mixed up. We talk about everything pre-Reformation as if it's this great big sort of mix of stuff, Catholic mixed in with pagan worship and stuff like that, and that's absolutely what's going on in this film. They, as you say, they've initiated basically a sort of cargo cult, pagan cult in the woods. And they've done it from scraps and bits and bobs of Christianity, Old Testament Christianity that they've gotten from their obviously Protestant curate teacher, and they're staging it in the ruins of an old church, not the new chapel, but the old church, the old ruined church, which isn't, of course, specifically Catholic, but just any sort of any construction of an antithesis between an old ruined church and a new church, particularly with a preacher who looks like that and behaves like that. It's just inherently in there. And then, of course, you add in the extra bit I mentioned earlier, the noise about James III in exile.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And of course, I mean, probably because at base level, it's more Apollonian versus Dionysian, isn't it? I mean, we've got the Enlightenment and the spiritual, sex and violence and order and restraint. I mean, the whole thing seems to be about balances, and I know it ends up on a reactionary note. Of course, I completely agree with that. But it is a film that sort of is inching towards the idea of balance of nature, and that once things are out of joint, chaos reigns. And I think, although the film does focus on the Dionysian horror, probably because that's an easier sell at the cinema if you want to make a horror movie. there is a heavy implication, I think, that the counter ideology, is also no good if it completely smothers everything else. Because we've had this film in which the behemoth, the devil, doesn't try to co-opt, as I was saying earlier, the murderous rampaging across the globe that England is about to engage in, which you'd think would be its target. If I can harness that, if I can harness the evil that men do and what England is about to commit to. No, it wants to take the kids and create something else, something counter to that. A different.
Literally, all it's trying to do is survive. All it's trying to do is come back to life and exist. It is trying to have an existence. It's trying to sort of scrabble it together from the bits and pieces that it can get from the world that exists.
And I guess the children are easier to inveigle its way into than everyone else because of their imagination, their naivety. But it's just, I just think it's interesting as a possibility. If we let's say endow Behemoth with a little bit more than just wanting to survive, but to actually permeate and influence and control. Because through that character of the judge, we've sort of got the Enlightenment made flesh. He may or may not be anti-Catholic. He may or may not be anti-superstitious. So we sort of end up with him or Fallowfield, we mentioned earlier, in this sort of dry post-spiritual Enlightenment. So it's no wonder the kids succumb to that ancient magic. Because it feels liberating, and the film is even positing that it's liberating. If cruel, but it's exciting. It's allowing their imagination to run. I mean, they've got to be put down at the end, but it does make it alluring.
And it does depend on how much agency the Behemoth actually does have.
Yeah, that would be the question, wouldn't it?
You don't get much.
I'm probably endowing it with more than, say, Jack is, because I'm getting the sense that it's sort of embedding its way. I mean, corporeally, it's in a bad state. It needs the flesh, but whether it's probably, again, because the film has that problem with the way that the three stories don't quite join up. The first story, I felt there is the strong suggestion, although it sort of changes course, rather than about possessing one person, it wants to become about having its body put back together again. There is the sense that it is sort of seeping into people's ideas and young people, the kids, which made me think that, although I'm very convinced by what you said earlier about where are they getting this language from, they're getting it from Fallowfield, which sort of like, but then I'd wondered, because of the way the first third of the film plays out, have they just sort of intuitively got its name because it's already starting, the influence is there even if the body isn't. But I think that's up for grabs, whether that's
totally, because the beast itself has no voice, does it? It has no voice. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't tell you anything about itself. It confirms nothing. The creature itself confirms nothing. I mean,
I'm just incredibly attracted to the idea of like the creature as this just the past desperately trying to still exist, that's what it feels like to me. It just feels that the past is trying to still exist in the present, and it's literally hanging on by its claws.
And it is the allure of that past as well. The excitement. I mean, even right down to us guys talking here. I mean, we're all of the modern era. We're all basically materialist in our outlook. We all possess a certain amount of scientific skepticism. But fuck me, we're drawn to this stuff. The way it activates the imagination and the emotions, the incredible pull it has on us, because humans aren't rational actors. We aren't just drawn to the Enlightenment. We're drawn to confusion. We're drawn to superstition. We're messy. We're half-formed. And I do think that the best of this film is the way it gets at that. It
is the best and the worst as well, isn't it?
Yes, it's the best and the worst. It sort of intuitively gets at it, and then it seems like it realizes it gets at it and goes, boom, right, we've got to put everything back into place.
Right. We've got to pull back. Yes, we've got to pull back. This has got to be a parable about the status quo and about how good the status quo is and how bad disruption is.
Yeah, and
But
I
it
think
does
it
feel
is
like
post
underneath
Manson,
that.
it is post hippie
Yes.
idealism. It is
It's the
it is that bit of
1970s.
the 70s where all the radical ideas, all the radical dreams, all the radical movements are crushed out. 68, the Soixante Huitards, they're finished, and
this is
the
not
way
a
the
commentary on that.
70s politics.
It's not a commentary.
No, it's not.
It's
No,
actually
it's just
part of it. It's an
yes,
expression of it.
yeah. The reaction is back. The if you like, the counter-revolution is here. It's about re-establishing the status.
So it's really interesting then that the basic maneuver the film pulls is that it takes essentially an argument against historical change in the sense of, young people making a new future, and marries it to the idea of the past clinging on as this dreadful thing. It's trying to, that is pure reactionary ideology.
Yes,
it is incoherent and lashed together from bits and pieces that don't join up, like Behemoth again.
Yeah.
And
like
what it's saying is, no to the future and also no to the past. Everything just needs to be this eternal, constant present.
But I think the interesting thing about the film, as it arising out of its flaw, is the fact that it's there, even if it is to be slapped down. Everything that you've just said, Jack, there is something that happens because the judge disappears for so long, and all the other authority figures or the other establishment figures sort of collapse in on themselves a bit because of their own foibles or the way that they're played. So suddenly the alternative past, which is also the potential future, and it's invested in young people and young energy, becomes really attractive for a moment.
Right. And isn't it fascinating?
The film is telling you one thing: this cannot stand. This is not allowed. But it can't help but showing, and of course it's queasy because there are parts of their alternative which is very cruel. But then Jesus Christ, the establishment is incredibly cruel,
right?
And in fact, more cruel in its way. Cruel.
It's
so
fascinating
you get this moment of sort of anti-heroism that runs throughout the film because the main authority figure is absent. So the film starts to take on a different contour, even though we know it is still reactionary ideology, and even though everything will be put back together at the end. You get this long tract of this film where it sort of feels, it's in the air. The change is in the air. There's something happening, and that maybe, but which feels longer and more sustained than in other films of this type, which are more super controlled in the way their narratives are constructed, whereby the hero figures or the establishment figures are more present.
Yeah.
So it gives the film a very unusual quality. Very unusual.
It's compounded by the portrayal of the seemingly heroic authoritarian characters, as Jack was saying earlier, because of the way they are. The way they are. I mean, the Reverend is particularly interesting. Fallowfield is very interesting, and it's all in the performance. He is like that. That's first of all, when you first see him, he is automatically hostile towards the children immediately. There's nothing has happened yet. Nothing outre or strange has happened yet, but he is already hostile towards the children. I mean, he has that line where he says to them, "How do you expect?" It's something like, "How do you expect to, have the grace of God if you will not attend to your lessons?" He's automatically condemned them, and he has this like weariness about him, where it's like, "You're lost already. I can't do anything. You're already damned, you lot. I don't know why I'm doing this."
Yeah, most of them are attending to their lessons, or at least, but he's preemptively given up on them. But he only has he only has affinity with animals. He likes snakes and he likes rabbits and hares, but he doesn't like children or even other humans. Clearly, it's just parenthetically. It's a revelation watching this film. If you grew up like I did, knowing Anthony Ainley entirely from 80s Doctor Who, where he played the 1980s version of the Master on Doctor Who, where he's phoning it in and he's being told from the gallery, "Oh, dial it up, go more over the top, Tony." This film shows you that there was a really interesting actor there.
But the only time you get it in his Doctor Who career, ironically, is in his last story, where he seems to assert, either he asserts his own, oh, screw you, I'm going to do it my way, or everyone's like just not really paying him much attention. But he has that one great performance in that role, and it's in his last story, which is nothing like the way he plays at any other point. But he is an unusual actor, Anthony Ainley, because I've seen him in a few other things, and he's almost incapable of giving a dead-on performance. There's something about his acting which is incredibly really ambiguous and mannered and off-kilter. So even as Fallowfield, the part
he was
really
apparently a very strange man.
Oh, he was. So. Yeah, I mean, I've met actors who didn't work with him, but he was big in the sort of amateur actors. Got this thing. I'm not one of them, but a lot of actors got this thing about cricket. And they have like actors cricket clubs and everything. I don't know where all that comes from. And he was, I worked with an actor on the stage, and something came up about Anthony Ainley. I thought, well, I'll listen in on this because being a Doctor Who nerd, I'll be quiet. And he said, oh yeah, he said Anthony Ainley, his locker used to be filled to bursting with other people's stuff because he was a kleptomaniac, but he would borrow it for 2 days or steal it. He would steal people's possessions for about 2 days, and then he would sort of come up to you surreptitiously. He said we all knew he was doing it because he had such a reputation, and we were all sort of fine with it because it was like, no, we'll get it back in a couple of days. And he said he would just sort of sidle up to you when no one's about. He said, I do beg your pardon, whomever. I wonder if you could just come with me to my locker. I think I found something of yours. And he would go through this whole ritual of giving people back their stuff. But he was very, very... He was an eccentric man, and it comes across in the acting where he sort of, and brilliantly so, as the Reverend Fallowfield, I think, he misses how the part should be played to the benefit of the film. The only one anecdote I know from him from this film is how absolutely, because the other thing was he was an extraordinary coward. It's something that Peter Davison often sort of satirizes him about whenever the sort of interviews. I mean, he's gone now, Anthony Ainley, but he would say, he was, for the man who was supposedly playing the most evil man in the universe, so he was a terrible coward. And I know that he was terrified in the confrontation with Angel Blake, because he was comfortable because he knew how the thing was going to be played, and he knew that she was going to be undressed, she was going to be nude, and it was made even greater because Hayden did it all in one take, 70, with absolute commitment. And he said he was so worried he'd screw up and force her to do another take. He said, you can actually see the fear in my eyes is not acted. He said, but the fear in my eyes is, I'm going to fuck up. I'm going to fuck up a line. I'm going to bump into a piece of scenery. I'm going to trip up over a cable or something. And this poor girl's going to have to do this again. And he said, I didn't know where to look either. He said, I was desperately just trying to find her face and her eyes. And I said, but he said it was like utterly terrifying.
Well, that actually works for the character bizarrely in the way that he occurs in this film, because it's so strange. Fallowfield just disappears, doesn't he? After the accusation, after the false accusation, he's just gone. And the way he plays it after, because of course he's tied up, he's led away, he's accused of all sorts of terrible things. And then they find out that he hasn't done anything because there's a murder whilst he's tied up and in custody. But the way he plays it after he's starting to be released is like, oh, fuck you all. Yeah. I can't, this is, damn you all.
Yeah, very realistically, the girl's accusation is immediately believed by everybody, and he's immediately arrested.
Yeah, do you know
that wouldn't be realistic now, let alone in.
But again, it's one of those really odd contradictions in the film, because you're absolutely right, and yet the way, and yet it's also that scene, oh my God, she's believed, and yet the way that it's reversed is really telling, because the way Angel Blake. I mean, what Angel Blake, the character, is doing inevitably comes across as someone playing on the idea of crying rape. It makes utter sense in a movie about competing forces where this world is kind of flipped over. But of course, watching it from a 21st century vantage point, it's horrible to us because we're in a world in which women struggle to make very real accusations of rape stick. And this film sort of both has a very real accusation of rape which sticks, and yet, of course, it's then proven to be a lie.
Right. It's part of the reactionary politics of the film, isn't it? It really is.
You go one way, you go the other in this film.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard seeing things framed as they are in this film. Yeah. We have to bring a shitload of context about what the film is half doing. Yeah. And of course, people are bad at that. They see the exploration of something, as you say, queasy or uncomfortable, and immediately then it's an endorsement. So I'm not convinced.
Fallowfield is another thing that's cleaned up in the more recent audio adaptation. I can't remember exactly what they do, but he's either sort of along with the rest of the heroes at the end, or they add a scene where he says, "I've had it, I'm off," and he gets a proper departure. He doesn't just vanish from the story the way he does in this. The scene where Angel tries to seduce him is really interesting, actually, and it's all in her dialogue, because she says. Well, no, it's not all in her dialogue, because Ainley is giving a good performance, and so I mean, Linda Hayden is just this incredible, fireball of charisma. She should have been a much bigger star than she was. But
she's staggering.
Yeah, she's amazing.
Almost frighteningly so, actually.
Did you say she was 17, Elliot?
17.
No, that's terrifying. That's terrifying.
I mean, we've got all sorts of other wrongness about this film, as if there wasn't enough.
Beyond the wrongness of it, for a 17-year-old to be playing that role and to be standing up to all of the,
Well, Ainley said,
and to be so commanding.
She was so formidable. She said that, here was he, a stalwart of the industry, and he said it wasn't just the fact that she was naked and he was uncomfortable with that and everything, and he feared that he would be the one. He said he was sort of knocked backwards, really, by the assuredness of that performance, and how assured this 17-year-old young woman was about having no clothes on and just owning her physicality and everything. Not that she should have had to, but so it's like I'm almost now as full of as many contradictions as the film, because on one hand I'm clearly admiring of that, at the same time that shouldn't have been happening. 17. Right. Come on.
No, I mean that's part of the exploitative nature of the film, isn't it? As we were talking about earlier.
And yes, and the director, I think this director, and his name escapes at the moment, but I think, like a lot of directors in this period, sort of gets carried away because of the context that we talked about earlier. And there's a certain chauvinism involved in that. But this is clearly part of that pop culture era of exploitation. It's this. It's Clockwork Orange. It's Walkabout. It's Straw Dogs. You name it. It's that pushing beyond, and unfortunately there seems to be always a young woman at the heart of it. Being sort of minced up. Character and actress.
To show the paradoxical power, even as it is absolutely bound up with patriarchy and sexism, misogyny and exploitation of women, and misogynistic society gloating over the mistreatment of women and girls, absolutely. But at the same time, it is a weird sort of backhanded acknowledgement of just the totemic power of a naked woman, for whatever reason, for whatever baked in historical cultural reasons. Just a naked woman on stage or on screen. The power in that scene is all with Angel. She is completely in control, and her power over the audience is complete as well. And it's it really makes you wish that Angel were given more characterization and more interiority. And what we get of her characterization, a huge amount of it for me is implied in that scene, because the way she talks to him, she says to him, "We want you with us." I think she means that. I think somehow, in some way, she means that. And then the other fascinating part of her lines in that scene, where after he rejects her, she calls him "you old pagan."
Yes. It's like, what? Yeah.
That's an insult for you? That's really strange.
But again, I think it's that thing you were saying earlier, Jack, that maybe the key is in that this is a force that is reaching back into the past to remake itself, this pre-Christian force. But the kids are of a future that is not yet formed yet, until the judge comes in and basically slaps it down. So again, we're pulling in weirdly opposite directions, that whatever the behemoth is, whatever it represents, they are also of the future because they're kids.
Yes.
And that future isn't formed yet. So she can say things like "you old pagan," and it sort of doesn't mean something. It's like forming a new vocabulary out of the bits and pieces of the old.
Well, it implies that his religion is, from her point of view, the religion of the past.
Exactly.
Religion of the past,
she's already of the future. She's trying to create that future very fast. History on the accelerated, velocity.
And as a metaphor for history, it's perfect for me, because the process that is underway is a process of radical change that is growing within the existing social framework, and it is simultaneously something that is happening to people and something that people are doing to themselves and to other people. As a metaphor for historical change, a materialist metaphor for historical change, it's perfect.
Yeah. Plus, you have that image as well to look at it mythologically. Therefore, it becomes mythopolitical, which I think is interesting as well. You have Eve going back into the garden, and she's in control.
Right.
She's harnessed the power of the serpent. She's in God's house, but she's in control. She's not secondary. And we know how the film ends, but I'm just talking, it's alive in that moment, as I was saying earlier, until the end and balances are restored. It's alive in that moment, just as the revolutionary potential is alive in that moment. They are the future until they're not. Yes. There's a space in the film before the history we know asserts itself, but for a moment there's a crackle, there's a rupture, and they can win.
Yes, and the film knows this to a certain degree, even if it's on a subconscious level. When the cult is referred to, it's always in terms of angel. It's never Behemoth, ever. Not by outside.
That's the classic reactionary viewpoint of an insurgent movement, isn't it? Get the ringleaders, take down the ringleaders, and that is precisely what the judge is trying to do when he tortures one of the cult members for information. He's not looking. He's looking for Angel.
Yeah. But it's the cult members themselves too. It's the cult members themselves. They don't talk about Behemoth as such. They talk about Angel. They want to be with Angel. They want to talk. They want to live with Angel. That's what it's so interesting.
Yeah, she is the power. And even at the end, as we said, the creature at the end is this weird sort of cowering, hooded, shrouded, weak, easily defeated thing that's literally hiding behind her at the ceremony at the end. And it's strange to see, the famous poster of the naked girl sort of huddled at the foot of this gigantic, imposing, cloaked, evil, demonic figure. That's flim-flam for the advertising. If you watch the film, it's the exact opposite. The creature is weak compared to her in the film.
Yeah. That is fascinating, and it is a really interesting wrinkle.
But those wrinkles, those contradictions, as we've been saying, they don't only go through the entire film, they go through every character as well. Because, it's much more interesting to talk about people like the Judge and Angel and even the Reverend Fallowfield. But watching it today, I was thinking about Ralph, poor old Ralph at the beginning.
Ralph.
Who unearths the evil, lest we forget. He is, pun intended, the sort of salt of the earth guy. He's the moral center, really, of the film.
You mean Abel the plowman who unearths the remains of Cain? Their roles reversed.
I know. But you, what is interesting again, and it feels like a contradiction, it feels like a flaw, but also it has a kind of a thematic coherence. He can't deal with the evil with Beb at all. He knows what's happening in that community, but his levels of denial are off the chart. And that actually feels almost germane in the light of the week we've had. But it doesn't feel, it makes the plot convenient at times, I get that. But it also feels very authentic because Ralph is what people do. They are confronted by horror and they pretend like it's not really there. It's too big to deal with. So there are these scenes that happen.
And they take it to the proper authorities, don't they? That's what
they
Ralph
take it to the proper
does.
authorities.
Yeah. Over and over again, he takes it to the boss, he takes it to the squire, he takes it to the judge, and he says, "There you go, you deal with it. I'll do as you say."
But even when he rescues one of the teenagers who I think it's Michelle Dotrice's character, who he knows what's going on. Now, you could make the argument that's purely to make the plot more convenient, so that you can keep sort of expanding on the levels of danger and the levels of exploitation, really. But I think it works as a character study as well. He's absolutely at sea. He believes it. He knows it's all going on. He can recognize it. He acts like it's not happening.
Yeah, and Rafe and Ellen are absolutely their tactic with Margaret is just to pretend that she isn't who she says she is, and that she doesn't think what she says she thinks, and that she doesn't feel what she says she feels. Ellen is just, oh, poor little baby, you're my daughter now. I'm going to look after you. While Margaret's like, I hate you. I want to be with Angel, and it's amazing. It's the level of just nope, not listening. You're going to be a nice girl because we say you are.
Yeah. Even when it's physically manifested, when they find the devil's skin on her, it's so interesting.
Yeah, but I mean, it's right back at the beginning as well. Let's say these funny contradictions, these things we think they're so strange, even in and of themselves. Not only in the way that the three narratives don't quite join up, but the first scene, the Peter in the attic sequence. I mean, it works if you engage with the idea that, as I suggested earlier, that Behemoth is a presence that's already seeping through it, even if it's not corporeal yet. That it's basically scrambling people's minds, either simply because it's returned and therefore that turns everything upside down. As soon as it's pulled out of the earth, everything is already slipping out of joint, or it's actively doing it, actively sort of deranging people's behavior, or it's just this weird half waking, half dream, or Peter is nuts, because why stick your hand in that hole?
Why turn over and
go to sleep in the same room?
In the same room, yes.
And I think because I have a tendency, mea culpa, I have a tendency to want to fathom this sort of thing, because I really try to guard against sneering at shit, because I'm not saying I'm in love with everything, I'm not that kind of viewer, but I really guard against my own cynicism. But it's deeply strange. It's part of the issue, as we've said, that of the shift from what the film was meant to be to what it turned out to be. But with the sudden disappearance of characters, not just the judge, but the way Peter, that from this point on, like the Reverend Fallowfield, haunts the edge of the narrative for the rest of the movie. The strangeness of that is incredibly appealing, and the fact that something has not only risen from the earth, but it's already in the attic. So it's meters above the soil. Yeah. It's in the ascendants, but of course it's still in a dark place in which to shelter. So we're sort of in the same. That reminds me of things like the Owl Service and even The Exorcist. But everything is now very, very symbolic. On it's in the ascendancy. Therefore, it can be this far above the earth. It's just been pulled out of the earth. It's in people's minds. It's making people behave.
It's just seeping out of every dark
because
corner.
It's seeping out of every dark corner. It's therefore seeping into the consciousnesses of the youngsters. And I think that does become a useful way to read it when the film itself, the narrative itself, just stops working.
And it does. I mean, it does contain moments that do reinforce that. I mean, when his fiancée is brought out of the attic and she's apparently deranged after encountering the Behemoth or whatever, there's that strange moment when she extends her hand when he's looking at her and it's a claw, but it's only him that sees it.
It's only him, isn't it? Yeah.
Nobody else sees it.
I think he sees his own hand as a claw, doesn't he? And then hacks his own hand off because he thinks it's a claw. It is slightly ambiguous. You could possibly, I think, if you watch that scene, read it as him accidentally hacking his hand off because he's being attacked by a claw. But I think the way that the way it's directed is that he's cut off the claw. Oh no, actually what he's done is he's cut his own hand off.
Yeah, it makes sense because he's grasped by the claw when he reaches his hand into the hole. It's almost like it's viral. It's like it passes physically. You get that with the the bit of the claw that the kids start passing around, that Angel takes.
Yes, yeah.
That seems to be how it passes. It's almost like a virus or a fungus or something. It's very, very peculiar.
And I think for as much as the director obviously had this decision which probably ran away from him, which is let's make it all one narrative. It's kind of interesting in the execution how for a very, not only a British film, a very English film, about a point in English history and about English law and about English anxieties. He uses a lot of this is just the film geek in me now, but he uses a lot of sort of cinematography lifted from people like Kurosawa, Misoguchi. So it's very Japanese the way it's shot. The cameras being very low to the ground, sometimes in the earth. Some of the sort of visitor shots and the way that he has people arranged, it's very sort of Sanjuro or Ugetsu Monogatari, people like that. But I think if he was a student of someone like Misoguchi, that actually even works in the film's favor, because his films were shot through with ghosts, hauntings, strange dream logic, things appearing out of corners, which are they there, are they not? Rather like the beginning of this film, like the first of the portmanteau sequences in Quaida. With the hair, that's part of that tradition. I forget who the director of Quaida was, but so it's a very odd thing that the execution of the film actually allows us to almost tap into a different film tradition's logic, which then even explains some of the strangeness of it, because although it's deeply English, it's also oddly Japanese, and therefore it freights across a lot of the even haphazardly, even unintentionally, a lot of the strange dream logic of Japanese films of that era, which were tapping into the supernatural or their own folk horror. There's an odd kinship between them.
Yeah, it's part of that weird duality that happens within the film, isn't it? I mean, not only like internally, but like mythologically. Ostensibly, it's folk horror, but because of the lack of explanation of what the behemoth is and how it works and what it's actually doing, because of its bizarre lack of agency and voice, it almost becomes Lovecraftian.
Yeah.
It becomes like a cosmic horror.
Yeah. In fact, in a way, the film that probably is its successor more than anything else is probably something like A Field in England, with its levels of ambiguities and everything. And it's a much more successful picture in many ways. But they do feel
coherent.
But they feel almost like cousins.
Yeah, it's so bizarre, isn't it? I think one of the things I was thinking about whilst watching it is that the film kind of lacks a project per se. It lacks in the way that, say, Midsommar and The Witch and other films we've done does not. There are very coherent, very solid ideas in most of the films that we've done. But this one, the project as it exists, is more about putting things on the screen. It's about putting certain images on the screen. It's about creating a horror film. And what ideas exist there are unconscious and dreamlike, or they're occurring subconsciously. And that is to the film's benefit, just as they're flaws, but it is actually to the finished product's benefit, just like the idea to collapse the triptych into one narrative. It's problematic. It's massively problematic, and it causes problems for the finished film. But part of that also enhances
Elliot was saying before that this is. I think you said this is your favorite of the famous folk horror.
I don't think it's the best, but it's my favorite
trilogy. It's my favorite too by a mile, and I think it's simultaneously the best of those three films and the worst. Objectively speaking, it's a mess. That it doesn't have a main character. It doesn't have a coherent story. As you said, George, it doesn't really have a project. It doesn't have an artistic project. It doesn't have a set of coherent things that it's trying to say. It is mainly, you hit it on the head. It's mainly just concerned with getting stuff on screen, and it really was just an in terms of the material circumstances of its production. This was just about trying to churn out another one of these movies that would make them money the way Witchfinder General did. Apparently, the original script wasn't set in this historical era, and it wasn't to do with demonology or witchcraft or anything to do with that.
Century originally. It was Victoriana originally.
Yeah. And Tygon, the people at the board or whatever at Tygon said, no, Witchfinder General did really well for us. We need another period piece to do with witchcraft and stuff like that.
It's why certain scenes are in it, actually. The scene where the girl is chucked in the river as a test of whether she's a witch or not, that is in it explicitly because the studio said, we need to tie it closer to the Witchfinder General.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the circumstances of its production couldn't be less auspicious, but somehow because they're dealing with images and concepts that are so primal and so deeply rooted, not only I think in sort of primal urges, fear of things like childhood and adolescence and sex and literally just, fear of things like hair growing on your body, the horror of puberty itself and the horror of there being children and the horror of there being adults and stuff like that. But also it's in touch with these primal things that are baked into our awareness of this country's history. Somehow along the line it ends up being the most potent, despite the fact that it's a really incoherent stew of ingredients.
That was something that pretty much when we still had a film industry to talk about, it was something that dogged British film industry in that whereas the film industries from other countries had started to develop around ideas or aesthetics or modes of production, whether it was something like, I don't know, French New Wave or Italian neorealism or Hollywood glamour, whatever it was, or the various genres that Hollywood was churning out. The British film industry didn't have anything coherent. It would just it was fast, it was factory, it was get it out and make it sensational, either sensational comedic or sensational dramatic or sensational. I mean, the history of Hammer is fascinating. Even why they turned to horror. I mean, it's all expedients, all happy accidents, and not as much as in the case of this film, but I mean, Hammer films are often completely incoherent and nuts, and they sort of slip and slide all over the place, even though they've got
not
traditional
like this,
plots they're working. Not like this, not to the extent of this movie, but there is something about the way the British were making movies and the conditions they were making movies under that. And this is an extreme example, but there are others where we're giving rise to these pieces that lack coherence, but they're full of all these other strange, suggestive things, these implications, and even I mean, I was saying earlier about films that were around at the time, and even something like Straw Dogs, which was meant, which is an American filmmaker. Sam Peckinpah, in exile from Hollywood, he makes his Western in Cornwall because he's really got no choice. And part of that process, and because he has to give himself up to the British film industry and the way it works, that becomes a deeply strange film to watch. And for a similar reason to Blood on Satan's Claw, it's an uncomfortable film to watch. But you've got this strain of films from across the Straw Dogs, Clockwork Orange, and that they're all, as I say, this is an extreme, but there is an incoherence that emerges from their production, and it is sort of unique to our then industry.
Absolutely. I think the lack of project, the lack of agenda within the film means that perhaps it's tapping into something a bit more fundamental. It's tapping into something that's cultural, that's in the air, and doing it without ornaments, without intention, in the manner of a dream.
And in
that
this
makes
film, you
it much
really
more
do
interesting.
feel the dark history. You feel and the mythology, the lore, everything sort of, it's off there in the corners of the film.
Well, whether the film intends it or not, it's there in the aesthetics. It's there in the soil. It's like the Behemoth, isn't it? It's there in the soil. It's there in the world.
Yeah, yeah. And as I said, again, it's partly learned from that or influenced by that Japanese way of making films in the 40s and 50s. But we're right down in the dirt. We're in the earth. We're down at the level of the peasants and the beast, and we're being dragged down further. The amount of shots where the camera, the only way it can work is the camera's in a pit.
Yeah.
It's very striking. It echoes the suggestions in the films purely through things like camera placement and that extraordinary soundscape as well. I mean, the music's amazing.
Yes,
But I'm talking about the way birds are put onto the soundtrack, the way the sound of dry mud shifting under people's feet.
Yeah.
The Foley is uncanny.
Yes.
Yeah, it is very much so, and yet it's very naturalistic as well. It's the music of the countryside and it's the real folk horror stuff, isn't it? It's the world, it's the natural world.
I mean, the score is magnificent. It's one of the best scores.
The score is so strange. It is strange because sections of it are almost comedic.
Sections of it are jolly, oddly jolly, and then you just get this shift. This little moment that's cold and weird and discordant, and it's so strange.
Yeah,
and
it's part of what makes it upsetting.
Yeah, so much of the cinematography is the same as well. I mean, it's filmed in the bright, shining sunlight. The countryside is in full bloom. Everything is green and in flower, and the sun is shining.
And again, that's one of the issues of British films. They couldn't afford night shooting. So suddenly daylight. It's the Hammer thing again. Suddenly daylight and woods in the dead of afternoon.
But
become unnerving.
It so works, doesn't it? I mean, when you have those wonderful moments where people, children are being accosted by other children who seem to be playing bizarre games where they're playing at being Pan or some creature of the woods, and it's in the sunlight, it's in the trees. Somehow that works. There's something fundamental about that is unsettling and unnerving. A child's game that goes too far, where imagination spills over into reality. There's something very creepy and very wonderful about that.
Yeah, and I think there's something about that film stock as well, because the difficulty you always have with any depiction, any screen depictions of history, is that they can look too romanticized, they can look too clean, and I mean, that film stock is really filthy as well. I mean, even in its cleaned up form, I've got the Blu-ray as well. I've seen it in a more cleaned up form, and even so, it's something about that kind of stock and the way it's processed. It is very murky, and it's like the film itself is haunted.
So it's something I love about films from this era, actually, and just generally from previous eras that are on these less defined mediums. It does lend them a patina. It lends them a feeling, and for this kind of film that already had baked into it the notion of delirium, it works. It works 1,000%.
But there is something as well about that assembled cast, because again, I watched it first thing this morning, which was odd in itself. I realised I sort of had to squeeze this film in somewhere along. So I watched it at 6 o'clock this morning. It was very odd. Is that the cast? I mean, they're very, very good, but they're almost, particularly the younger ones, they're almost like they're in a delirium.
Yes,
there's a real danger to the performances where you start to feel like they're real. They are not real in the sense of naturalistic, but in the sense that these guys are all charged up. Now, I don't really know what the production was like in terms of being on set or the atmosphere that was created. I don't know how the director operated. Oddly, I do know more about these things from Witchfinder General, but I think those stories are much more famous. but there is a kind of
shooting
energy.
was innocuous. It was fairly innocuous. It was fairly like workmanlike. This shoot, It was very clean, very workmanlike.
Because it's like a fever pitch, and you think, well, if it's good acting, great, but there's a real danger to the performances in this.
The two young guys that capture Kathy with let's play at being cannibal. We're cannibals and you're our captive. I mean, I want to shout out Wendy Padbury. I think she gives an amazing performance in this film. She is at intensity level 17. The scene where at the funeral where Angel is giving Kathy the evil eye, and it almost feels like it's implying that Angel is implanting the infection in Kathy just by looking at her.
It doesn't. She clutches her side and is in pain for a moment.
Exactly. It's like Angel is transmitting it into Kathy through her eyeballs, literally through the evil eye, sort of pouring the curse into Kathy just by looking at her. And Kathy feels it, and she looks round at Angel. And Wendy Padbury's face, it's harrowing. She looks absolutely horrified and terrified. And then of course later on you have the rape scene, and I think we should probably put some sort of warning at the front of this that we're going to be talking about that. It's almost unwatchably horrible, and the reason that it's almost unwatchably horrible is that performance from Wendy Padbury, because that is completely authentic, and it's excruciating to watch.
It's the range of emotion she has, isn't she? It's just the confusion. I mean, you have to look at it contextually as well. This girl has no idea.
The point I was going to make was just the two guys. The two guys, when they do the kidnap scene, they are so incredibly sinister. The way they give those performances. And everybody is on this page, on the same page.
Yeah. And I have read that, funnily enough, Wendy Padbury was very conscious. So there's a drive in her performance as well for professional reasons, because she was very conscious of that. This was her sort of
this was the first thing she'd done after Doctor Who.
Well, exactly.
It was almost immediately after Doctor Who.
She was known for kids' telly. I mean, she was known for Doctor Who, and there was some other shows she was on. The name escapes me. Something like that. Anyway, so she was like, I've got to really. The way young people do is, I've got to really grab this with both hands, because I've got a chance to find a new mode that I can, that I can be accepted in as a young actor. But it's really funny because when I was attached to Doctor Who in the way I was, and I used to go to the conventions, and I met Wendy Padbury a few times, and she was absolutely brilliant company, great to be around. But I always used to think, it's that terrible thing. I don't want to ask you about playing Zoe. I want to ask you about Blood on Satan's Claw, but how can I reasonably ask you anything from something you made 40 years ago? Because you don't, because you end up hanging around with other people who are actors and things in a green room, and of course they're like you, they're just working, and they don't think about the thing that they did 40 years ago any more than they think about the thing they did 3 months ago. But because you know one is a nerd, there was that bit of me was like, I'm not going to say anything. We're just going to talk about normal things like the how much milk is in this coffee that we've been given, or whatever, or isn't it a terrible day outside the window? And yet the geek in me was screaming to ask us something about Blood on Satan. I didn't.
Oh, brilliant. But no, it is an extraordinary sequence. It's one of the moments of high horror in the film, obviously, and it's directly after that very sinister sequence where he's seduced like a child is to play a game, and that's horrific in and of itself.
Again, she's so good. You can see just on her face she knows this isn't legit, but she's also thinking, how do I say no? What do I do? How do I get out of this? I know this is wrong. I know this is a bad idea. What do I actually do about that? And you can see her thinking, there's nothing I can do. I just have to play along in the hope that I get an opportunity.
It takes us back to at the beginning when we were saying about Tony Todd. Now, Tony Todd had, he still had a good career, but there is a sense we think we lose so many really good actors, and I mean I cover all genders when I say actors, fall through the gaps. They fall out of the business through no lack of talent, because there's a serious problem with people who have very little discernible talent who get just clean up. And then, of course, there are extremely talented people who also get plum roles. But Wendy Padbury is definitely one of those people who think, it wasn't. What you are all doing in this is, Wendy Padbury and others, what you're all doing in this is first rate, but the film was never going to do it for you. It's not that kind of film. It was never going to push you.
It was always going to be ghettoized, wasn't it? At that time, this kind of film was always going to be ghettoized. I mean, even when I was a kid, I remember seeing this for the first time, and it was very late at night / early in the morning, like mid 1990s, maybe on Channel 4.
Yeah, probably the first time I saw it too.
Part of the band season. Am I right in saying that?
I think it was
part of the band season, because I do remember that in the lead up to it, there was all sorts of talk about how controversial it would be. And again, it's that, it's from that same blood, but it's from that same gut of films. But I think again, it's something today that I noticed where I thought, because there are moments in this film. And it does say something about the era and what directors male directors as well, got carried away with once censorship was relaxed. Because there are key moments in this narrative that take place off screen. And it's usually violence against or murder of the male characters. But we get the attacks on the young women, or the shots of young women wearing no clothes, so highlighted. So what I should just make that clear. When I use the phrase "of its time," I don't say that as an excuse, but there is something that, as I said earlier, it just emerges in this strain of film: Straw Dogs, Saulo, Clockwork Orange, so much else, which it seems to want to make political points about misogyny and the objectification of women, but it ends up very, very exploitative. And as we've said, I love this film. It's difficult to watch in places, and yet, and all it reminded me of, I mean, I've never, because this film hasn't warranted the level of scrutiny, academic scrutiny, in the same way as something like Straw Dogs, because, as you said, George, it's ghettoized, it's considered low culture, But there's a very infamous rape scene in Straw Dogs as well, scene of sexual violence, and the way that movie. I've read some incredible feminist readings about Straw Dogs, and the way that movie skewers a sort of fragile, toxic masculinity, and it satirizes a kind of rugged individualism and male violence. But Peckinpah was a product of toxic masculinity. He was someone who celebrated rugged male individualism. Somewhere between him and what ended up in his film, there is this crisis or rupture where these other values explode out of it, despite him. And a similar thing happens in Blood on Satan's Claw, as we've been saying, on a number of fronts. But it's like, as much as I have respect for those readings, and as much as I adore this film, and those readings, some of them are by like really, really good feminist writers as well, they're very convincing. I'd still prefer a version of Straw Dogs where Susan George is clearly not in all that immense discomfort. I still want a version of Blood on Satan's Claw where Wendy Padbury doesn't feel that, as a young actor, I've got to grab this by the scruff of the neck because this is my way out of kids' telly. You dig a little and you find how deeply the exploitation runs. And it's
you don't need to dig very far in this film. You really don't. I mean, the framing of the scenes where there is clear sexual violence happening.
And it's tough. There's nothing about the overriding 70s-ness of it which softens it at all.
Not at all. No, it's actually, and there is a real sort of objectification of children in general. Young people in general are completely objectified in this film. It's part of the paedophobia of the film. They are expressions of elder characters, and that's it. Or they are monsters. That there's no space in between. There is nothing else.
Jack was saying, if all things were equal and we could have the I mean, this is brilliant, but if we could have the version of this that's in our head and our hearts, you would have that interiority invested in Angel in particular.
Yeah.
It's the difference between, it would really make this soar.
Oh, there's a better version of this story. There's a better version of this story where it's about what we've been talking about, where it's this
just out of
contest.
reach. Can't be done in 1971.
No, it just cannot. You could not have Angel be a character. You could not have Angel be a character with interiority. No way.
No. And the sad thing is, even if you got that bit right now, you'd lose all the rest. Because there is no way a film could be executed with the potency and the strange skewering off into all directions.
Yeah.
Because 2024 film production doesn't allow for that at all. Everything is super controlled.
You are right. It's
cleaned
that part. That's part of the strange, ambiguous joy.
We'd gain
this
something,
kind of film,
but we'd lose so much else.
Yeah.
So it's a constant. You can never have the perfect artifact.
It's complex, isn't it? It's complex. We've spoken about this before. Liking and enjoying work that is ideologically objectionable. We talked about this in Manhunter, I do believe.
And we mentioned in Midsummer. We were saying about the projection from the right. That we only ever want a kind of purity, moral purity or ethical purity in our viewing, and it's like nothing could be further from it, because we gain so much, not purely just on the way we're engaged or fascinated or just downright enjoy it, but you gain so much from watching films that are reactionary or
absolutely. I mean, I think one of the earliest chats we ever had, Jack and Kit and I, was about the Nolan Batman films. I mean, God, if you want reactionary films,
I mean, I've always my equivalent would probably be, because the sort of long-term film I've been fascinated with since a child, but it is incredibly fascinating. That's the original Dirty Harry movie, the original Don Siegel Dirty Harry movie, particularly because Siegel himself thought he was making something really liberal. And he's completely blindsided by the force of what Clint Eastwood is bringing to it. Of course, he's a very right-wing guy, and also what the bloody films, the tricks the film's pulling, the way it stacks the deck in regards to the Zodiac Killer, or Scorpio as he's dubbed in that film, so that you have what is basically Death Wish 4, but it's very stylish, and it's beautifully scored, and it's got these interesting wrinkles in it. But if I was all about ideological purity or whatever, I wouldn't go near that film at all. But I go back to it every few years. I find it's got an incredible pull on me, for God knows why. But it just
I love that tension. I've got to I find the problems of that tension really interesting, and something that facilitates consideration and internality and thought. I mean, one of my formative texts is the Chronicles of Narnia. I learned to read with the Chronicles of Narnia before I went to school. Love that part of the metaphysics that is part and parcel of my imagination is from those books. And it will always be thus. And so I will always love them. I will always find them to be sacred texts after a sense, but they are fashy as fuck.
But we all do this, don't we? Because we all, I think, on some level, part of the draw of getting together on a podcast and doing this, or just the way that we engage with text, is we're rewriting them. We've got the rewritten version in our head that will never be done. And that's not to use as a substitute for what you're getting, because you're picking up the thing you're getting is allowing that to actually happen.
Yeah, the thing I love is when you find radical implications even inside the reactionary ideology of a text.
Accidental and strange, but they're there.
The problem with reactionary texts is not that they're wrong. The problem, in some senses, there isn't actually a problem with them at all. There isn't actually any sort of coherent a priori argument for why there's any sort of connection between a text being, in some sense, what we would call good and not being reactionary. There just isn't. There are plenty of texts that are both, at least in terms of how we interpret things. And there are a lot of texts. I mean, my classic example of this is always Conrad's Heart of Darkness, because I read that when I went to it was almost the first thing I studied. My first year was studying English literature at university, and you read it and you think, okay, this is This is anti-colonialism. This is anti-imperialism. I get that. And then you read Chinua Achebe's famous essay about it. Things fall apart, and you think, "Oh shit, this is actually incredibly racist." And then somewhere along the line, you think, "Oh, it's anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist, and it's incredibly racist." And then if you keep going back to it, you realize this is an incredibly powerful text. It might even be incredibly powerful as an anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist text because it's incredibly racist. And this is what keeps me coming back. The way texts have these interior dimensions and these dynamics that work in this way. And I'm trying to write about M.R. James at the moment. Similar stuff. I'm finding similar stuff in M.R. James's stories.
But I think that's why the element of this film that keeps it sort of hypnotic for me is, as I said before, it's the film that is set at a real choke point in our history, in English history. But while you're watching the film, you're seeing a potential future being presented to you, which of course can't happen. Not only does the establishment figure have to win and to restore everything, but we know how history unfolds. But it's alive in those moments, and then you have all the potentialities. You think how those things are drawn together and how they could have been, what could have happened, and that becomes really exciting.
Just to be a bit crass about this, the end of the film, it just stops.
It just doesn't. It just stops.
It just stops on a freeze frame of the fire, and you can just see, the judge, one of the judge's eyes through the fire, this staring, crazed eye, and you don't see any of what happens next.
No.
And in many ways, if you look upon the end of a text as the thing that forecloses upon its meaning. But the fact that the end really, I mean, apart from the fact that it's implied that the behemoth is destroyed, the end is just amputated. So this text is open in a sense. Anything could happen next.
Yeah,
literally anything could happen next.
That's the other thing, right? You can project potentials onto what comes next. So we know that the behemoth it has this kind of viral element to it. Well, how many of those kids already have that viral element in them? The behemoth could reform. It could occur in some other shape or some other state or in some other expression in their lives.
If we take the implication in the graveyard scene seriously, that it can be passed through the gaze, through looking.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, then the judge, right?
The judge.
So many. Yeah. Of course.
Yeah.
But is the judge actually the antithesis of this? I mean, there's an awful lot of noise in this film about witchcraft and the witch trials. And one of the things that makes the judge incredibly resistant at the start is the idea that he's listening to people talk about this, and he's worried, oh, do you want to restart the witch trials? Do you want to restart the witch craze? Because look how bad that was. So this is post that era. He's an educated modern man as far as he's concerned at this point in time. He doesn't believe any of that stuff. And one of the things he's worried about is the idea of sort of restarting that viral contagion of paranoia.
Yes.
Well, he then goes and does it to the point where you have the scene where Margaret is thrown into the water, and then she's rescued by the good people that kind of try to insist that she's actually a good girl, really. And then the judge, who's been worried all about, oh, do you want to start the witch trials? He gets his hand on her, and suddenly she's being tortured for information. And suddenly he's rounding up a posse of pitchfork pitchfork. They kill Angel with a pitchfork at the end. It's the classic symbol of the mob.
People.
The Enlightenment man is very, very quickly dragged back, isn't he?
Is this like the reaction to the problem being as bad as the problem, or is it all just one problem that's manifesting differently in different places and different levels of society?
Right.
It's so unusual, the actual specific, because it's not general. It's a specific time that this is set in. As you say, it's after the hysteria of the witch hunts and with the witch trials. It's after the Civil War. These are not years that films or they tend to be set in.
No,
you would set your film in the height of the Civil War.
Yeah.
Or you set your film the Reformation, or really when history is absolutely screaming.
Yeah, when there are
this is an extraordinary quiet moment, still in a febrile moment of history overall, but it's in quiet years. It's very odd,
isn't
this
it?
is like 1699, 1700, something like that, isn't it?
That is very peculiar, isn't it? That is
it's the years of the Protestant settlement after the Glorious Revolution. That's an unusual period to have a text.
How much stuff is set in that period? How much fiction is set in that period?
It's generally a period of quiescence, isn't it? There's not much to speak of.
And yet, this is one of the things I've been researching for my essay series that I'm working on. One of the ironies of the Protestant settlement is that it kind of, because you have in some sense the final defeat of the Catholic challenge. Obviously, you still have the Jacobite rebellions rumbling on, but basically, when William and Mary come in and all that, it's over.
It's done.
England is now a Protestant country, but they bring in religious toleration laws as well, and the strange paradoxical byproduct of that is a kind of explosion of religious difference and non-conformity, because it's somebody wrote something like, as soon as it becomes non-mandatory to be Church of England, suddenly to be at this point in history, it becomes like to be an English Christian is generally inherently to be a Protestant, but it's not necessarily to be an Anglican. You have this religious revival that's just around the corner, and it takes the form of this weird sort of fragmentation of English Protestantism into all these different. This is the start of the process that will lead to the proliferation of Methodism and all these different subgroups. So this is when this is happening, and what you could view this as a film about the early days and the abortive quashing of some kind of new religion. And that ties in with Angel's line, to Fallowfield about "you old pagan," where she sees herself as having the religion of the future.
Definitely.
It also ties in with
very convincing.
It ties in with the wider politics of the film as being a reaction to the 1960s as well, which was also a period where all of these new ideologies were efflorescing, and people, young people were able to choose a little bit more about their own identities and their own beliefs than before. That's very interesting. That makes the film
it's a similar dynamic.
Yeah,
it's a similar dynamic, sort of a dialectic of permissiveness and rebellion.
So the film is simultaneously demonstrating that or commenting upon it and then reacting to it. That's really interesting.
And it happened by accident.
By accident, yes. This is not. I hazard to say this is not a project of the film. It's not like, say, Ari Aster at the helm of Midsommar saying, "I'm talking about this. I'm talking about this." No. It's accidental.
Yeah,
it's in
as you say, the original idea was to have it set in the Victorian era or something.
But this is where it puts down that ridiculous rightward notion about as soon as you put politics and things, it's like it cannot be helped. This stuff is in the air. It gets soaked up. Right. And there's no such thing as political neutrality anyway.
No, of course there is.
That's a childish
it's
notion.
So childish. It's absurd.
To be neutral is to uphold the status quo,
Yeah, whatever you do, it's going to be unearthed. It's going to come out of the hole in the attic floor. It's going to seep into everybody. It's going to get into your flesh, and it's going to self-assemble.
Yeah, right. That's it. That is it entirely. Yeah.
Wow.
And it's great.
Yeah, so ultimately, what this film is a metaphor for is itself.
Yes.
The behemoth is the process of this film sort of self-assembling.
Kind of, yeah. It's odd, isn't it? It's like a Frankensteinian thing going on here. Love it. Love it.
And it does seem to have, I know obviously it was part of that whole cohort of films that ran into trouble, and then there was it was but it does seem to have had its renaissance, doesn't it? I mean,
definitely it's one of those films that's cut as the more recent renaissance of folk horror has occurred, on the back of things like The Ritual and Midsommar and so on and so forth. This film has crept back into public consciousness, and there is much more the way of analysis into it, and it's much more readily available now than it has been for a very, 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 very long time.
I mean, I picked up a
I think you can
copy
see
last year, so I'm very happy.
I think you can see the influence directly in Midsommar.
Oh, definitely, yes. There are references to this in Midsommar.
Yeah, shooting the horror in the bright, shining daylight. You know, and
definitely.
The cultish scenes and the orgy scenes and things. It's
very much.
This is a very culturally significant piece of work, and it's one of those interesting texts which has kind of become that simply through being democratically selected as a piece of work just by people rescuing it from obscurity. Because this was not a heralded, fanfared film at the time. This was just another schlock horror movie that came and went, and people forgot about it.
Yeah, reaction was not even terrible. It was just bland.
Yeah,
people just like, oh, it's another one of them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That was kind of the critical reaction, generally speaking. But it has been consistently present. I mean, I remember it being on quite a lot in the night, like in the sort of the early 1990s. It was around quite a lot. It was often, but always late on or early in the morning. So it was only certain types of people who were going to see it, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure the first time I caught it, it was a very late viewing.
Yeah, definitely.
Like my first
people do remember it. People do remember it. I mean, you mentioned the League of Gents and alumni who did the radio version. They speak about it quite a lot in terms of its influence on their comedy writing, even their bizarre horror comedy writing.
It's probably had the chance as well, I imagine, to be rediscovered because, and probably this is also the reason why it was given short shrift at the time, because there was such a glut of stuff from studios like Hammer. This was a non-Hammer production, so therefore it's got it ends up standing apart because Hammer did so much. If you're going to, it's almost, people don't necessarily, unless it's one of the first 3 or so, don't talk about individual Hammer films. It's always Hammer. Hammer is a thing.
Yeah,
it's like one gigantic, like monolithic.
It's synecdoche, isn't it? It's
that's better. Yes, it's a synecdoche. But
to the point where individual Hammer films kind of have to fight for an individual identity, don't they?
Yeah. That's true. That's true. Yes.
Whereas this being outside of that frame, it almost had that. It could be rediscovered. It was either going to be rediscovered and given a lot of attention as a single one-off film, or it was just going to languish in obscurity. But if it had come out of something like Hammer Studios, I mean, it'd be very different anyway.
Yeah,
so it almost, but it wouldn't have had the revival. I don't think it would have had the attention thrown back on it, because everything just gets sucked into the black hole of it's a Hammer film.
Exactly, and I think
it would have always been there.
Yeah.
In retrospect, what's happened is it's become part of the folk horror canon in horror. So it is now mentioned alongside The Wicker Man and The Devil Rides Out and Dennis Wheatley stuff and so on and so forth. It's categorized. It seems to have found a place for itself.
Yeah.
It is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And seems to be more well liked these days as well.
Which is, that's good.
It's nice to see. It's nice to see. Well, guys, Blood on Satan's Claw. Blood on Satan's Claw. That was
Blood on Satan's Claw. That's a hell of a title, apart from anything else.
It's a real title.
Inaccurate, bizarrely inaccurate, like a lot of horror films were back then. I mean, Satan hasn't really got much to do with this film.
Is this thing even Satan? I mean, people talk about the devil's skin, but there's no reason to think this is Satan.
There's if this is Satan, then Christianity's got nothing to worry about. It's not very kind of pathetic.
That brings back to Hammer, because I know Jack and I have joked before about the wildly inappropriate names of the various.
I love that.
Films, particularly the Frankenstein cycle, where it's like the film titles almost contradict. They almost seem to be assigned to the wrong film in the sequence.
Yes.
No, I can do this. The first one is The Curse of Frankenstein. There's no curse in that movie. The second one is The Revenge of Frankenstein. He doesn't take any revenge in that movie. The third one is The Evil of Frankenstein. He's actually quite nice in that film. The fourth one is a bit of an outlier. It's called Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. for most of the film, nobody's trying to destroy him. Somebody does try to destroy him at the end, so I'll give you that one. The one after that is I think, the attempt to relaunch with Ralph Bates, which is called, I think that's called The Horror of Frankenstein, which doesn't mean anything at all. But the last one is called Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell.
Which sounds
guess what? Guess what there isn't one of in that movie? A Monster from Hell.
I mean, that really is the coolest title. And the supreme disappointment as you're watching and saying, it's just the plot of the previous 3.
Right.
I want to see the Monster from Hell. What's that got to do with Frankenstein?
Yeah,
go for it. Oh, right. Okay.
Frankenstein actually meets a Monster from Hell. Now, that's a fucking movie.
That's a film.
Nope. Although I do quite like that film.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Blood on Satan's Claw. Yeah, an odd one. It's a peculiar one. I mean, revisiting it was great. I've got to say, I really enjoyed rewatching this film. I just
tucked up in bed at 6 o'clock this morning, and it was still dark, and it was like, I mean, I was just out of sleep, and it was very odd.
I haven't seen it since I remembered I was like a teenager.
I missed one out. I missed out Frankenstein created woman, in which he does not create a woman.
No. Soul transference, isn't it? That's awesome. Possibly my favourite of that cycle as well. I really like that. Yes. But then it's not to railroad the conversation too much, and I know we're wrapping up, but it's rather like the Dracula cycle. Again, the critical orthodoxy is to say the one closest to Stoker is but there's it's Taste the Blood of Dracula, which I love because it
Linda Hayden
really
again.
Again, she's in this, and
again she's amazing,
and but it really
similar sort of role in some respects.
Everything, it's a. I mean, he is again
good.
A redemptive figure. I mean, he goes after all the pillars of Victorian orthodoxy. I mean, he.
Oh right, okay.
It's honestly, I mean, I've got such a soft spot for Taste the Blood of Dracula. He's basically brought back, and he just takes on all these pillars of Victorian society.
Sounds good.
It's so fucking good.
Sounds good.
Directed by Peter Sasti, of course, who directed The Stone Tape. So
yes.
Oh wow. Yes. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, but it really is. It breaks with the we've got to do the same story.
We've got to do this again.
Great.
The reason that's the best of the later Hammer Dracula sequels is because it wasn't originally meant to have Dracula in it.
No, that's right.
Oh, right. Okay. So it is actually like an original story, right?
They champion him. It works. It actually works.
Brilliant. What did we say we were going to do next, guys? What's next on the docket?
I thought that we were going to sort of keep this conceit going a bit longer. I think Robin Redbreast was mentioned.
That sounds good to me.
We did also introduce the idea of doing the Wicker Man, though.
Yes.
Do we want to?
Yes. Good point.
Do we want to do that next?
Do we do that next?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh well, God, guys, the Wicker Man next.
The Wicker Man.
No, I have not seen that in years, so that'd be nice and fresh.
That's going to be interesting. One of the big ones in horror. Like, I mean, when people think of folk horror, they generally tend to think of the Wicker Man, don't they? Let's be honest.
Still one of my
we do have to decide if we're watching the theatrical version or the so-called director's cut, though.
Which version do you want to watch, guys?
I'm easy. I've tended to, in the past, stick to the theatrical one. So I'm watching an alternative one if it's because at least it would be different to what I'm used to.
Okay, shall we go for the director's cut?
There's 3, isn't there? There's 3?
I mean, the one that's popularly available is on the iPlayer, and it's basically the one that's on the DVD and Blu-ray that's distributed now.
Yeah, I think there is the theatrical cut, the director's cut, and the extended cut.
Yes, that's right.
I didn't know that.
That's right.
I think the consensus is that it's the middle one that is, but so it's not it's not like the 92-minute one, and it's not the 85-minute one, it's the 88-minute one or something like that. It's the middle one that everyone is sort of agreed is that's the one.
That's
right. Maybe we'll hammer this out in the WhatsApp chat.
Boom boom.
Yeah, good idea.
But it does contain. I remember because it really activated the nerd in me, because I can still remember to this day. I was about 16 years old, and I'd bought on the strength of a couple of singles, the first Sneaker Pimps album. So this is Day to Me, and the last track on the Sneaker Pimps album is their version of the song How Do from The Wicker Man. And I remember being like with some friends, and the record was playing, and it got through the end, and I sort of jumped out of my skin and was like, "It's the Wicker Man!" And looked like a complete nerd. But hey, what can you do? But yeah, really good version. So if you ever get a chance to listen to the Sneaker Pimps version of How Do from the Wicker Man, it's great. It's really great.
Oh wow, yeah, I'm gonna have to. I mean, I like the music from the Wicker Man. I think it's got some great music.
They do a really good version. It's sort of, well, as you would imagine, it's the Sneaker Pimps, so it's a very 90s trip hoppy version of How Do, but it has some samples from the film.
Right, okay.
I mean, it's great. It's a cracking track.
I always find that takes people by surprise. They sit down. The people have heard of the Wicker Man, or they've read about it in reference to horror, and they sit down to watch it, and they find this film where people erupt into song, where there are actual, honest to God, musical numbers. They're a bit shocked.
Yeah. It is another peculiar film.
It's a strange ass film.
A good deal more coherent, I think, than this one. But
definitely.
A very odd experience,
but very peculiar. Yeah. I mean, we'll talk about it when we get there, but there's moments in that film.
Well, yeah.
The tonal shift, right? It's like, ooh.
I introduced this film to a friend of mine who I went to drama school with, Andy, and it instantly became his favorite movie. He was it's that thing where you can see someone's reaction. It's like he was completely blindsided by The Wicker Man, and then he became really obsessed with it.
Yeah, that seems to be the process. That seems to be the way it happens. Like throughout it never aired. It was so difficult to find throughout my entire childhood, right up until I was like late teens. You couldn't get it anywhere. And then there was that DVD that was restored that has all three versions on it and has the commentary that's Edward Woodward, Christopher Lee, moderated by Mark Kermode, and it's utterly brilliant.
But I think that's the one I have, because I do have a set somewhere.
Yeah, I think that's the one I have.
But the thing that was absolutely wonderful about this guy's reaction was he genuinely was not primed by anything. He had never read a film article about,
so he went in completely fresh.
Yeah, and I remember
lucky bastard.
I remember in the early sequences, because my other friend Ed knew it as well as me, and we were like, "Oh, we'll show you this film then, Andy." And I think for about 10-15 minutes, he was like, "Guys, what the fuck are you showing me?" He was really properly sort of like, "Are you having a laugh?" Then you could just see this thing happen to him, and by the end of it, he was like, consequently, he became more obsessed with the film than Ed and I were. We were just like, "Yeah, this is a really great British film. It's got Christopher Lee in it. What more do you need?" And we saw him in real time. Not someone who'd, like, as I say, he hadn't been reading articles in Sight and Sound. He hadn't. It was completely fresh for him, and he was already sort of in his middle 20s then, and he was just like completely taken with it. It became his film.
That's fantastic. I mean, as I said, I heard it
time as well. Like, oh my god, it's reached him. He's gone nuts about it.
That's brilliant. Cool. As I say, I'd heard it referenced all the time and parodied to the nth degree, like references in comedies and all sorts of stuff. But I'd never seen it. I'd never seen it until I went to university and this DVD came out. And I remember getting that DVD and the DVD of Don't Look Now together and watching them back to back, never having seen them before.
God,
that was a day. That was a day. That was amazing.
Yeah. I think you mentioned that in the Don't Look Now episode. Actually.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Amazing experience. Well, guys, before we go, is there anything either of you would like to pimp out?
I could do with some work, can't you? Let them pimp anything out. It's gone very dry, but it happens like this now and again. So I've got to just ride it out
between roles.
I mean, if you're looking for work and you're artistic, head on over to Blue Sky at the moment. Thanks to the, the recent tragedy that's happened in American politics. There's been a massive exodus of all of the artistic communities from
suddenly
X.
my
and we're all over on Blue Sky now, and
followers just suddenly started like going up and
unbelievable,
up
isn't it?
after being stable for so long. And I thought, oh God, these are all people I used to know on Twitter.
I've got to thank Jack, because Jack, you put me up for that,
because I bailed ages ago on Twitter.
Horror writers.
Yeah,
and since you did that, the influx has been insane.
Oh, splendid.
That's great.
Absolutely insane. So that's very, very nice.
Oh, excellent.
Good. I'm glad that happened. Excellent.
Yeah.
I'm glad I spotted that go past me on the feed, and I thought to click on it. Excellent. Good.
Yeah.
Good. I did something good that day then anyway.
Got an entire sort of like new community to engage with now. It's brilliant. Very, very
good. Cool. Great.
So anything you'd like to pimp out, guys?
I'll just say whatever I did last time. The same old links.
I could just do the same, really.
No, you actually do stuff, Jack. You release things. You contribute.
Well, I try to. Yeah, the thing I'm working on at the moment, as I mentioned, is a series of essays on M.R. James, ghost story writer, short stories, and eventually I will start also writing about the television adaptations. I'm currently in the middle of a so far surprising even to me length essay on one story, the stalls of Barchester Cathedral. But that's going up at Eruditorium Press. If you donate to my Patreon, just $1 a month, you will get advance access to that, or at least you will if I manage to get anything finished in time to give you advanced access to it, which doesn't always
fair
happen.
To say that you were a little bit clogged with projects last week.
just a tad, yeah. What with everything going on in the world, my main project with Daniel Harper, the podcast I Don't Speak German, has never been more important. And you can go and listen to that. That's on Libsyn. You'll get links to everything I do on my Blue Sky account at Times Carcass. That's everything, I think. Yeah, Patreon, Eruditorium Press, Blue Sky, IDSG. Yeah, that's it. That's me.
Excellent. Links below, guys, as per. As for myself, same as usual, round here on Exaggerated Elegy, currently doing the Silent Hill 2 remake, let's playing that guys, we need to talk about that. We
might have a project down the pipe somewhere.
Well, my God, I'm blown away. This has been one of the most formative horror experiences I've had for years. It's amazing. It's incredible, and I need to express it somehow. Need to tell you how good it is and why. Apart from that, there's also chats like this, podcasts and whatnot about media and short stories and all sorts of different things. If you go over to gingernutsofhorror.com, you'll find the My Life in Horror series of articles that I inherited from Kit Power, which are deep dives into media of all kinds that had a profound effect on us. There's loads backed up there that's due for release very, very soon. So I'm not even going to go into it. There's tons. Just go over to Ginger Nuts of Horror. There'll be loads of stuff very, very soon. That's my non-fiction writing. If you want link to my short story collections and all the anthologies and things I've been published in, go over to strangeplaygrounds.com or go over to Amazon and type in George Daniel Lee and you'll find my my author page. And also over to Arrow Films, check out the Hellraiser UHD and Blu-ray box set, The Quartet of Torment, because Kit and I are on it. And we're still really, really proud of that. There may be another one coming up soon.
Ooh,
we'll see.
Really?
Yeah, I'll talk to you about that offline. But yes, there may be something coming. Guys, that's brilliant. This was great fun. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure.
My pleasure as always. And we'll speak to you next time, guys. Until then, bye.
Ciao.
Bye.